Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Lane Potons. I am the NASW Region Rep for Region 6. We are excited that you're joining us today for our Region 6 webinar on successful living with chronic and progressive illness, a unique pain management challenge. Before I turn it over to Dave for the presentation, I have just a couple quick housekeeping items to run through here. So NASW Michigan has a ton of upcoming events. We welcome you to view our community calendar online and to sign up for these. Many of them are free CEs for members as well, and we know that this is a great time to get your CEs in if you haven't. So you'll see one on social work licensure, one by the Sasha Center coming up. Our SUD training series continues, as well as an SUD Supervision Institute. Community organizing and racial justice, self-care workshop. So you'll see we have a ton of different offerings. I won't spend a lot of time on those, but you can look at them online. We also welcome you to subscribe to our YouTube page, where you'll be able to see recordings of a lot of our different events if you're not able to catch them live. And as you'll all see, as you're joining, you should have access to the chat during today's webinar. So we welcome you to use that chat box. If you have questions throughout the webinar, there won't be a live audio Q&A, but we'll make sure to reserve time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to use that chat box, and I'll be monitoring it throughout for questions that pop up about the presentation content today. And we do ask that you stay muted just to avoid background noise and feedback throughout the presentation. If you need CEs, you are required to complete the evaluation following today's session. I will drop a link for it in the chat at the end, and it should pop up at the end. If you do not get it either of those ways, NASW staff will be sending an email out with a link to the evaluation likely tomorrow after the webinar. So just be sure to complete that so you can get your CEs. If you are interested in presenting at an upcoming webinar about a topic of expertise, feel free to reach out to Danielle Haskin at NASW Michigan. Her email is there. And just a plug for Region 6, if you're a Region 6 member and are interested in presenting or participating in planning an event here in our region, you can reach out to me as well. And we just want to thank you for your membership. If you're a member, if you're not a member, we encourage you to become one, and I'm happy to provide more information offline to anyone who's interested. All right, and I'm going to stop my screen share while I introduce Dave, just so he has an opportunity to pull up his screen share. So Dave Ware is your presenter today. Dave is a licensed master social worker with 40 years of experience providing therapy and counseling services to a diverse clientele. Dave has also been living with a chronic medical condition for 36 years, which has given him personal experience to add to the topic that he'll be talking about today. So Dave, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who's, excuse me, who's joining us today. This is, as Lane kind of alluded to, a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I'd like to share some ideas with you, some of which are originals, a lot of which I've taken from other people, and I am going to be giving credit to where credit is due at the end of our discussion. Well, I plan to talk with you for about 45 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, and then leave time for questions afterwards. And we're going to be depending on Lane to keep track of these, because although I have a large amount of experience in the clinical world, I am a technological Neanderthal. So if I really screw up and block you all out, we can depend upon Lane to get us connected. All right, enough about me. And I'm having trouble making the screen advance. There we go. All right, so I want to talk with you a little bit about our objectives today. The whole area of chronic progressive illness, and a way to kind of a thumbnail understanding of what that term means, is any kind of physical condition that affects your functioning. Anything from cancer to multiple sclerosis to severe diabetes to chronic migraines. The list is pretty endless. but there's some certain things that they all will have in common in terms of the experience of the person who has them. And having a language that you can use to kind of help you assess what's going on and to communicate to your clients, I think is going to be really useful. It's going to be useful in a way to help clients develop strategies for living as successfully as possible. Okay, what do I mean by success? A little bit about me now. Got my master's in '81, married in March of 1985, diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in June of '85. Was able to maintain a full-time private practice, full-time salary work experiences, plus about 5-10 hours a week in private practice from '82 to 2014. And I'm currently practicing my private practice group about a little bit less than half time. Really love the outdoors, travel, woodworking. And for the past 40 years, fatigue, body aches, irritability, and confusion have regularly been debilitating for me. In addition to that, I want to share a quote, if any of you want to really kind of show off, well, before I do that, I call it my achy, cranky, and stupid periods, when all those things flare up. And I'll tell people, hey, look, if I'm batting 1 for 3, I can hang in there. But if it's 2 for 3, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bow out. You may have heard a baseball term there, 1 for 3, 2 for 3. This is a quote, some in the baseball world. Considering myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. That was said by Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig was a baseball player at the same time as Babe Ruth. Those names may ring a bell for you. Lou Gehrig held the record for the most consecutive games played. While he was in the prime of his career, he developed arterial lateral sclerosis, which is a progressive, crippling, and fatal condition. At Lou Gehrig Day in Yankee Stadium, he said, through a hoarse voice, because he was already so impaired by the disorder, "Today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." In addition to being achy, cranky, and stupid, I also have that experience. There are days when I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. Yes, that is me. And there's nothing like the first 10 seconds of an airplane, I gotta tell you. But I'd like to have you think for a second. What do we mean by successful living? What does that phrase mean to you? Take about 10 seconds. You have some ideas kind of forming in your mind. It'll be important to be aware of how you would answer that question, because we also want to know what are your clients' ideas, and you want to be able to know the difference between what you think a successful life is and what your clients think they are. These are one of the quotes I'm going to give credits to. It's important that you help clients develop their ideas of successful living. Because for people to deal with catastrophic challenges, to deal with things that really disrupt their lives, there's going to be a pattern of things that they do and things that change them, transformations. You want to help people transform. The question, why go on? For many, if not most, people who you will encounter who have a serious chronic progressive illness, CPI, it's going to shatter who they are. It's going to shatter their sense of who they are. And it's also going to it can also make them question, why am I still here? What makes this worth going on? To the extent that, according to research, medical disorders that involve impairment and/or pain, being diagnosed with a terminal condition, or being perceived as being a burden, all those are higher risk for suicide. It would surprise me if someone who does have a significant CPI at some times has not contemplated ending their life. I have. I'm not going to do it, but that is an experience that you should be aware of when you're dealing with, when you're assisting someone who has a CPI. And it's not a once and for all thing, because that sense of purposelessness or loss of meaning can be a one-time experience. It can be a repeated experience on and off. It can be a progressing experience. Okay, so speaking of purposelessness, the antidote is a sense of meaning. What do we mean by meaning? The subjective experience, that my experience, the things I've been going through, it makes sense. I can understand it. It fits with who I am now. And that I continue to have a purpose. I continue to make a difference. I continue to matter. If some, according to this study, and this is taken from one of my reference materials, even folks with late stage cancer responded better to a therapeutic approach that incorporated in it developing a sense of meaning and purpose than to other standard therapeutic approaches. Your basic cognitive behavioral, whatever kind of theoretical orientation you're taking. When there was the addition of a focus on a sense of meaning and purpose, the psychological profile, even for people who were not only with a terminal condition, but were aware that they had a terminal condition. They were less depressed, they had better energy, they showed improvement on all of the all the metrics that we use to evaluate someone's psychological well-being. And as the authors, Van Tongeren, and again, their reference will be available at the end of the book, especially if your clients are suffering, and suffering is multidimensional. Suffering, and I can never get through it. I can't deal with this. If there's a way to build a sense of meaning in their lives, that will open the door to positive therapeutic change. So let me see if I can back this up without erasing on my. Now we're going to get into kind of my experiences over the years, things that I have found to be helpful in my work, excuse me, with my clients with chronic, progressive, and/or terminal illnesses, as well as in my own experience. And just in my head, my heart, I'm going back and forth between what's worked with clients and what's worked with me. So I guess kind of an unabashed disclaimer. As much of this, a good portion of this is as much personal experience as it is research, clinical, significant to 0.05 level data. So again, feel free to note questions, wonder about how applicable this is. Take what take anything that's useful for you, and leave the rest. Anyway, these four basic tasks that I have identified. First is what I call retaining. What characteristics and ability remain essentially unchanged for the person with a chronic progressive illness. When you have a client, the question that you want to see if they can answer, and the way you would word the question or approach a topic is up to you. You use that in your own style. But in your head, kind of have the general idea of how do I think? How have I learned that my client can answer this question? I can still fill in the blank. In my case, I can still do therapy. I can still put together PowerPoints. I can still do X, Y, and Z. modifying. What characteristics and abilities does your client have, but they need to be adapted or changed in some way in response to the changing circumstances created by their condition. I was telling Lane before we got started, my original plan today was actually be in my office and use my setup there. But I had a flare up this morning. I was too tired to put things together and get to the office. The essential nature of the task was to do this presentation. What I modified was how I'd go about doing it. You're in my living room. Well, welcome to my home. And so modifications can take multiple forms. I can still, and that first link would be filling in, do this activity or accomplish this task that is meaningful for me by, next phrase, doing it in a different way than I used to do. And helping your folks see that, hey, you're still, in my case, I'm still a therapist. I'm still a woodworker. I just don't do it the same way I used to before. When your folks with CAs or with chronic progressive illnesses can say that with a sense of kind of pleasure or a sense of ability, you've done a great service for them. Releasing. No, I didn't say grieving. We'll get into that in a minute. Releasing. What characteristics and abilities are simply no longer there? How will your client answer this type of question? I can no longer. Or, and again, something else we'll get into later, what do I, in my clinical judgment, believe is in my client's best interest to no longer fill in the blank? I love fishing. I'm a member of Fish Anonymous. Have admit my life as powerless over fishing, and it's not unmanageable. I have no intention of changing it. But I can no longer fly fish. That's a particular technique that requires a lot of repetitive hand and small motor activity. That tires me out immediately. So I can no longer fly fish. But I can still do other types of fishing. Then there's discovering. That task amounts to identifying what new types of characteristics and abilities can either be discovered or developed. Abilities that maybe the person either didn't know they had or has been able to develop along the way. Again, a question that we want to have in mind for your clients to be able to answer is, hey, I can do this now, and I couldn't do it before, or I didn't realize I could do it. All four of these things can form a part of your clients developing a successful life, developing a sense of meaning. I want to emphasize that these are not stages. These don't occur in a particular order. And they often repeat. And sometimes one or more of them never happens. Sometimes someone doesn't need to discover something new. Sometimes they can't modify. Sometimes they will need to do all four of these things, again, repeatedly. And here is where we want to get into the difference between releasing and grieving. Just hang on 1 second for me. Thank you. Okay. I don't know. There we go. Grieving is a repeating experience because the loss never ends. With progressive illness, people lose something along the way. That needs to be acknowledged and validated. I'm not going to go back over or what we call grief work. I'm going to assume a basic knowledge of that. But however it is that you work with grief, you need to be aware that someone with a chronic progressive illness will be experiencing that to some degree. Greater, smaller, frequently, infrequently. So in other words, the grief is an experience. The tasks are choices. One can mitigate or exacerbate grief, but you can't turn it on or off. Tasks you can to some extent. Tasks are things that you can help your folks develop. Grief may occur most strongly when someone is releasing something. That was a little bit too soon. But not always. Again, we'll get to that a little bit later. Grief may happen when someone discovers something, when that's their primary experience, because it triggers for them memories. So imagine, if you will, kind of tasks going down the left side piece of paper, grieving going along the bottom. As these tasks are going through, the grieving may spike up and down as someone is experiencing these different tasks. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics that are involved in the tasks. First of all, let's talk about retaining. Remember, chronic illnesses are a shock and a result in a loss of kind of sense of who you are. But pay attention to overly global statements. I'm not worth anything. God, I'm not pulling. One of my clients that I'm working with recently, his phrase is, I'm not pulling my own weight anymore. And that was a more global statement about a sense of worth. What you want to do is, validate the feelings of fear and loss and anger, but pay attention for indicators of things that are still true that maybe the person is overlooking. A client I'll talk about a little bit more later. Hey, look, man, you explain that really well. I get it. Just something you've always been good at. Get them to think about things that are still true for them, that are important to them. Let's move on to the idea of modifying, what that contains. Can this meaningful activity be done in a different way that will be acceptable to your client? To do that, you want to help your client identify the essential nature of the activity. I'll use my woodworking for an example. I don't have any cute little things to show you, but the essential nature of woodworking for me is to be able to have this finished product that I know that I made. I want to validate the history of how they did that. Yeah, man, when you were coaching by running up and down the sidelines and jumping around and acting excited, that was a real way that you communicated to your players. That was important to you. But then you want to be curious with your client about other ways to accomplish the essential nature of the activity. For me, I really loved using what's called a gouge, to kind of a chisel, and a hammer to tap out inlays, to move along the piece of wood, to create channels in which I would then inlay other pieces of wood. Remember I said about quick and repetitive motions fatiguing me? About halfway through an inlay project, I was done. So I switched to a Dremel, an electric tool that you use to do the same thing. I switched that instead of using gouge for wood inlays. Doesn't seem like much, but that was a task for me. It was hard for me to put these tools down and pick up a new tool. But I was able to still create my inlays. Judgment between what can be modified, what needs to be released. Remember I said earlier, one of the more challenging tasks can be helping clients recognize and accept when is either no longer possible or at least no longer advisable for them to do these things that at one time had a sense of meaning and purpose, gave them a sense of identity, but now it's just not a good idea to do so. And the clinical judgment here is multifaceted. How do you make a judgment that you have an opinion of this is the case, particularly if the client wants to continue to do it? Then how and when do you communicate your assessment to your client that this is the case? And again, I'm going to assume kind of the basic set of rapport building, timing, tone of voice, pace of speech, tools that we use when we communicate things to clients that maybe it's difficult for them to hear. But I want to qualify, qualify a little bit in terms of saying that can be a grief experience. Now I'm married, I've got kids and grandkids. And for a while, I used to be a rock climber. Do you hear the past tense in there? That was important to me. I taught my kids how to rock climb. I can't teach my grandkids. I haven't got the endurance to either climb myself or to hold the rope strong enough to be sure they're safe. I just can't do it anymore. In fact, I still feel a twinge when I say that. But I also can't clean my gutters anymore. I can't climb up the ladder and pull that stuff out of the gutters. Little did I know that my wife, God bless her, for years, every time she saw me climb up them, because remember, I've had MS for 35, 36 years. And I walk with a cane, more times than not. So can you imagine what my poor wife went through every time I went up that ladder over the past 20 years? Finally got through my stubborn head that this really isn't a good idea. And it was a sense of relief for me. I looked at the leaves come down this fall after we put the gutter shields on our gutters. And I thought, yeah, don't gotta deal with you guys anymore. But that was a source of identity for me for a while. That was a source that gave me a sense of meaning. I can at least take care of my house. That had both relief and some grief. And you want to normalize that, educate clients, especially about ambivalent reactions. Yeah, I can see why that was difficult for you and why you feel a sense of relief about it. It's okay. Of course it is. You can probably figure out that the helping people release something can be one of the more complex aspects, one of the more complex sets of clinical demands of any of these tasks. On to discovery. Because of the way my screen's set, the right set, but I'm assuming everyone else can see the wheelchair. Lane, is that correct on my part? Is that correct? Okay, cool. Reminder, the loss of meaning or purpose is a loss of belief that who you are or what you do makes a difference. Take a look in that guy's face. Do you think that he has a sense of meaning and purpose in rolling his chair down that track? Probably, most likely. He was an athlete before he ended up needing to use a wheelchair. So the task for us then is to discover with our clients new or over ways to make a difference, to have a sense of purpose, to incorporate the chronic progressive illness into their sense of identity and who they are, and how they can use that to matter.
Oh, I only have 16% left.
Okay. I was just told, I think, that my battery might be running down. I
That
thought
was
I had.
someone unmuted, Dave. I took care of it. You're good.
Okay, good. Thank you. I was worried about that one. Like I say, technological Neanderthal. Doing the presentation doesn't throw me a bit, but throw a technical glitch in my way, and you get to do immediate crisis intervention for me. Okay. All right. Cool. Anyway, we want to discover new or overlooked ways to make a difference. How can the person believe that they still make a difference? What can they discover? Or what can they learn that's new? And often the chronic progressive illness experience itself can be a source. Again, that little thing of it matters to me that I can give my colleagues a framework to help other people deal with chronic progressive illness. That would not have mattered to me if I didn't have one, but now it does. And since it is something that's personal to me, it also increased my awareness, something I want to pass on to you. Beware of countertransference. Don't push this issue. When someone comes to you, particularly if they're feeling in the moment overwhelmed, desperate, and or angry, and they're just kind of bouncing all over the place, it can be personally challenging. It can elicit a sense of helplessness. You remember the old maxim, don't just say something, sit there? Simply being with someone in the midst of their distress and combining empathy with a bit of, if you will, peacefulness, that is really, really powerful. If you've discovered something, if you've noticed something, and you kind of maybe gently inform your client of that, and they don't seem to want to hear it, just make note of it, don't push it. You can circle back to it. What you want to have going on in you is a sense of curiosity and creativity based on your knowledge of the person you're working with. What do they have? What do they bring with them that's important, that maybe they're overlooking? What would it be like for them if they fill in the blank? If you use a Dremel instead of a hammer and a gouge? What would it be like for you if you just got some gutter covers on those things? And again, real important for the discovery stage, especially when you just start to introduce it, is to be non-invested. Simultaneously, hold the awareness. Yeah, this is something that this person can do that they've overlooked, or at least they're not talking a lot about. And they don't need to do it now. Okay, let me illustrate this with a guy I've been working with, Bill. I asked if I could use this story. And the reason for asking was twofold. One, I wanted to. Well, threefold. One, I wanted to. Two, I didn't think it ethical for me to do so without asking him. And three, I got to know him well enough to know that if he felt that his story could be a benefit to someone else, that would give him a sense of purpose. That would be important to him. Anyway, now his real name. He is a high school history teacher and a soccer coach. He does have a rare cancer. It's characterized by slow progression, high mortality rate, and uncertain treatment regimens. He'd always been popular with his students and his players, and he clearly communicates how much he cares about them. They know that they matter to him, But for the prior 15 years, he would stand and be fairly demonstrative during his history classes. He would walk up to people, he would interact with them, he would use a lot of gestures. Can't do it anymore. And he would also can no longer demonstrate the soccer skills that he wants to teach his players. And so when he started meeting, he really struggled with how he saw himself. I'm not a real coach anymore. I can't do these things with my players. And he was angry. And man, I don't even think I'm worth a fill in the blank as a teacher anymore. I can't be with these kids like I used to. And depression, irritability, and guilt were his major kind of, if you will, cognitive / emotional symptoms. His wife had encouraged him to seek treatment because he had started talking about suicidal thoughts. So with that in mind, I'm going to run through a series of questions. In the interest of time, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. And then I'll tell you what things that we did do. But start thinking to yourselves, from that little vignette that I gave you, what kinds of things did Bill retain? What was still true about him as a teacher and as a coach? Whether you can see it or not. What things would you think that Bill could modify in terms of teaching and coaching? What are some things that Bill needed to release, let go of? There's some things that Bill discovered in there. Any guesses as to what they were? Okay, I'd like to give you folks a minute to think about these questions for two reasons. One, I think it's a good idea for thinking about these questions. And two, over the years, I've learned to identify a little kind of sense of tingling at the base of my shoulders that's telling me I'm starting to fatigue a little bit. So I'm going to give myself a minute to take a breath, give you a minute to respond to those questions. I have 137 and some odd seconds, at 138 and some odd seconds. I'll move on to talk with you about how we did implement these four tasks. You're gonna get to watch me drink coffee, turn away if you want to. Okay. This has been after a number of months in treatment, and Bill does see himself as living his life successfully. What he retained and was able to recognize as we talked was his dedication to his students and his players. The students and players continued to matter to him. The guy knows soccer and knows history. I was an assistant coach for my kids' soccer teams when they were in junior high school. I didn't know diddly about soccer going in. Now I know somewhat about soccer. Bill knew soccer. And he also knew history. His knowledge base was completely intact, as were his verbal skills. He knew how to communicate things to people with his words. Based on all of those things and kind of building on that, we could have him be okay if he sat while he was teaching. He could still be a bit of a clown. He could still use one-liner zingers to make points with the students. When he was coaching, he just could not bring himself to sit all the time, and so we didn't go there. But he could alternate sitting and standing while he was coaching. That was okay with him. He would use his voice to instruct and ask his best players to demonstrate. There's a particular movement in soccer called a slide tackle, and tackle means going for the ball, not the person. So Bill, particularly with his freshman team, would say, okay, this is what slide tackle is. This is how you drop one leg. This is how you use your arm. This is how you get back to a standing position. Any questions? Okay, Sue, you've done this for a couple of years. Sue, I want you to take Jane and have you demonstrate a slide tackle, as opposed to him doing it himself. There were some things Bill did have to let go of. His physicality. As we've already mentioned earlier, you saw what some things they could no longer do. And his experience of almost limitless energy. He had to come to terms with that, both at school and at home. And we could share that experience, and I leveraged that. My particular metaphor for that is I have an energy tank. And that energy tank is a little bit smaller than Bill's energy tank. And when the needle gets to about 1/4 tank, I better start slowing down or stopping. He also had to give his perfectionism towards himself. I'm no longer this great coach that, even if it was on an unconscious level, I thought I was. I no longer can do things exactly as well as I once could, even the things I could retain. But along the way, he discovered he was more respected for his personality traits than for his physical ones. The players, as I mentioned earlier, knew that he cared about them, knew that he knew the stuff. Students the same way. He also discovered a newfound responsiveness to the kids who didn't quite get it. As he saw himself struggling through this whole process that we were going through, he discovered a new empathy for the kids who didn't quite get it as quick as the other kids that he was working with did, either in the classroom or on the team. The phrase, get back on the horse. One session, he said, you know, the last round of chemo didn't do what the doc says it's going to do. And man, that was tough. I was down. I didn't want to keep up with this, but I got back on the horse and decided I'm going to keep going with this. And after a loss, he shared that with his players. Yeah, we lost. It sucks. We don't like it. You all know, you know, I got cancer. And man, when the doc told me I didn't like it, about the result, I didn't like it either. But I got back on the horse. How can we help each other? How can we help each other get back on the horse and get ready for the next game? All right, before we move on to kind of open discussion, I'd like to sum up. CPI is their source of physical, psychological, and spiritual pain. I hurt a lot, many days. People with chronic illnesses often do. But there's a psychological impact and a spiritual impact. Who I am and do I matter? And lives literally can hang in the balance. Suicide is a risk. However, remember, if purpose, meaning, and significance can be experienced, a successful life will follow, however long that life may last, whether it's months, weeks, or years or decades. Learning how to retain, modify, release, and discover are strategies for finding that sense of meaning. And with that, all types of pain become more manageable. The pain doesn't go away. It becomes more manageable and worth it to manage. Okay, these are the books. These are some books I really can encourage you folks to look into. Deep Survival and The Courage to Suffer were books that I directly used in today's presentation. LMSW, I think he recently retired. He was a professor at Michigan State School of Medicine and specialized in psychotherapy for neuropsychological conditions. Very, very worthwhile read. Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth is an example of using spirituality to help people develop a sense of meaning. for me personally, my Christian faith has been useful as well. Seeing an example in the person of Jesus has been helpful for me. So any kind of spiritual traditions can be very, very useful for folks. All right, I want to thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to me that you folks now want to be of assistance for people who have these kinds of conditions. I can be contacted either through my practice group, Guide to Personal Solutions, and also by email and by shooting me a phone call or a text message. After we're done with a little bit of Q&A here, certainly happy to answer questions. I'm also available for ongoing consultations. It'd be essentially a professional service. But if you have cases, situations that you think would be useful to consult about, I'd be available to do that as well. So again, thank you so much for being here today. I really personally appreciate it. And Lane, I guess to respond to questions,
Yeah.
I turn it over to you. So did I just sit here and be quiet until you tell me to do otherwise at this point?
Yeah, I can. We have a question in the chat that I can give you if you'd like to respond to it. So
Sure.
Christina asks, how do you suggest involving the client's family, friends, and social support in their?
Very good question. I would start by asking your person their relationship. Are these people already folks who are support? If they are, then having all of them in the same session can be useful. And kind of be looking for the same tasks for the family members. If on the other hand, if your client experiences the family members as kind of being almost a negative, I use the term, again, this is my experience, are these energy suppliers or energy drainers? If they're energy suppliers, then yeah, involve them almost as you would with any other kind of clinical issue. If they're energy drainers, you can work with your client in terms of, okay, how can we help you educate them? Do we think they would benefit from therapy services themselves? What type of support organizations, such as the Multiple Sclerosis Society, the Muscular Dystrophy Society Association, that have resources for family members, are they open to getting hooked up with other resources that help them explain? Would your client want you to work educatively with them? Would your client want you to, with your client present or not, provide information to them about what it's like to have tasks dealing with chronic and progressive illness? Those are my quick responses.
Wonderful, thank you. We had a couple of requests for you to go back to the references slide. So if you don't mind going back to that, and then folks can look at that while you answer our next question here. Perfect. So someone says, I have a lot of clients who have fibromyalgia and it's frustrating for them to not have a formal diagnosis. How do I help?
Oh boy. That's a big one. MS is characterized by misdiagnosis for the first couple episodes. And some of that's going to depend on where their frustration is. If they're saying people don't think I have a real thing, validate for them that they have a real thing. You are tired. You are in pain. We don't need a formal diagnosis to know that. So you validating their experience can be very, very helpful. I'm presuming from the question that the person says, I have fibromyalgia, but I don't have a formal diagnosis yet, that they're involved in some spectrum of medical diagnosis and or treatment. Based on that assumption, see if there is a way that you can work with your clients. Okay, what is known? What would you like to know? And then one of my favorite questions when people ask why is, if you could answer that question, how would you use that information to help you? Let me repeat that. If you could answer that question, how would you use that information to help you? Because a lot of times when you talk with someone about that question, well, I would do thus and so, thus and so, thus and so, or it would just help me feel differently. If they come up with, I would do thus and so, and thus and so, and thus and so, then you can ask them, well, can we do thus and so, and thus and so now? What would you need in order to do thus and so, thus and so, thus and so now, even if you don't know why? If they say, well, it just helped me feel more settled, more at peace, or feel better. What does better consist of? Does better consist of a sense of identity? Does it consist of feeling that I matter? Does it consist of being less afraid? And kind of help them address those questions.
Great, thank you. We had a quick request for you to go back to your summary slides, the one slide back, I think, and then I'll ask you then another content question here. And just as a housekeeping for folks, this is being recorded, and as far as I know, will be put on the NASW Michigan YouTube page as well. All right, next question here. So do you have any recommendations when working with clients who require recurrent acute hospitalizations to manage their symptoms?
On a kind of leaving it, let me respond to that first on just kind of a general level. It would seem to me that everything you talked about could apply to that. Because I am imagining a pretty potentially profound experience of kind of the repetitive nature of grief. A revisiting of a needing to go through all these tasks. Okay, I think of my client with cancer. He does have repeated experiences, and each time he does, we rethink virtually all 4 of these tasks, and he re-experiences some level of grieving, be it much or be it little. So the same strategies, again, on a general level, I would think, just pay attention to what your client is saying about either the pending hospitalization, pay attention to where they're at in terms of the retain, modify, release, discover area. And then after they get out of the hospital, what's different now? A kind of subset of that is fear. Every time I get an MRI, I feel a little bit afraid. I feel a little bit, geez, is there going to be a lesion that's now closer to my brainstem? Might I not be able to walk again? So pay attention. I guess kind of look at all of these things as fitting into treat the hospital experience as a discrete loss, as a discrete change, and then pay attention to fear.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we had a couple other questions. Catherine asks, how do you deal with asking for and getting reasonable accommodations? And I would guess this could apply to oneself or one's client.
Having asked for reasonable accommodations in my career. Boy, let me give you another resource. The Job Accommodation Network, JAN for short, multi-level resources available there. A client of mine in the private sector who has muscular dystrophy, asking those questions. I referred him to Jan, and they were able to give him some ideas in terms of, do I ask for reasonable accommodations or not? How do I ask? When do I ask? What do I pay attention to be sure that my Americans with Disabilities Act rights are being respected? So just in terms of the not taking off my therapist hat and putting on my EAP consultant hat, which is what I did for 20 years. The level, one important level is, what are you asking in terms of an advocacy level? How do you ask in terms of getting what I need to do to be able to retain my employment? And that's where I want to refer you to Jan to be looking for ideas. Also, the state of Michigan's I forgot which department because it changed so often now. Now they change often these days. The state of Michigan website, if you look up reasonable accommodations, reasonable accommodation requests, there's going to be a lot of information there too. On a more personal level, how do I ask? Can include, what am I comfortable with? And that will be where we have a combination of how's a person think about themselves, the stuff that I talked about, and how that dovetails with how do I make a request that'll be effective self-advocacy. Sidebar comment. For state of Michigan employees, there's a form that you need to fill out that details what accommodation are you requesting and why. Or what accommodation are you requesting and how do you justify it? So again, you can look to the state of Michigan's webpage for information about that. And I don't know if other employers use specific forms or not. So look at that as being just kind of an example. So that's what I got for that issue.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Someone is wondering which of the books you pointed out would be helpful for clients themselves, or if you have additional recommendations for clients, I'm sure that would be welcome as well.
Okay, let me then move back to that slide real quick. Forward to that slide real quick. Wherever to that slide real quick. Deep Survival and New Faith, or excuse me, New Earth, would be really kind of more in the self-help rank, more in the self-help realm. Deep Survival, I would encourage you to encourage your clients to look at that as the book was written primarily for people who are in acute physical survival circumstances. But I really do believe it's generalizable to these kinds of issues. In fact, there's a particular section, I think it's either 8 or 12 essential skills for survival. And as I'm looking at those, as I was looking at those, thinking, yeah, man, that applies to me. One in particular was see the beauty along the way. There's always something that you can notice. Then perceive and believe. Don't sugarcoat what you're going through. Yeah, I have multiple sclerosis. I could be in a wheelchair next week. It's possible. You don't deny the reality that's in front of you. But those two books, I would say would be kind of more in the self-help range. Psychotherapy for neuropsych conditions and Courage to Suffer. I use those books in my therapy practice a lot, dealing with people with chronic illness.
Great, thank you.